age of robotic capital. Across global factories, robot density has already more than doubled in just 7 years, rising from 74 units per 10,000 employees to 162 units in 2023. A quantitative signal that the shift from human labor to robotic capital is well underway. The total operational stock of industrial robots worldwide has reached roughly 4.6 million units in 2024, after a 9% year-on-year increase, and each new generation is cheaper, more precise, and more flexible than the last. Today's industrial robots are still mostly caged machines doing repetitive tasks. Yet even these limited systems have already raised labor productivity by roughly % for every incremental uptick in robot use across advanced economies. Baxter, an early general-purpose industrial robot costing around $22,000 and designed for 6,500 working hours, effectively worked for about $3.4 per hour, less than the minimum wage in most OECD economies when it launched a decade ago. This is the early curve before humanoid robots like Optimus deploy at scale. Optimus is designed not just to weld or paint, but to walk through human spaces, manipulate everyday objects, and link to AI models that learn any task demonstrated in front of them. Once such systems become as cheap as mid-range cars and are manufactured by the millions, the marginal cost of an extra hour of physical labor drops asymptotically toward zero, limited only by maintenance and electricity. When marginal labor cost hits zero, economic history is in many ways the history of falling marginal costs. From steam to electricity to the internet, each wave made an extra unit of output cheaper to produce. Industrial robots already show this pattern. The upfront capital cost is high, but once installed, every additional unit they produce spreads fixed costs over a bigger base, driving per unit labor cost down and boosting capital's share of income. In the robotic capital era, imagine a factory staffed not by 1,000 workers earning $10–20 per hour, but by 1,000 Optimus units whose effective labor cost per hour approaches cents, not dollars. If a robot's full life cycle cost, hardware, energy, maintenance, software, is $50,000 over 10 years and 40,000 hours of work, the effective cost per labor hour is around $1.25. As production scales and learning curves cut costs by 20–30% per doubling, that number falls even further. At that point, the marginal cost of adding more workers is nearly frictionless. A firm simply spins up more robot units or cloud robot instances and copies trained behavior like software. Unlike human labor, robotic labor never demands higher wages, never forms unions, never sleeps, and does not exit the labor force. In economic models, this looks like an almost perfectly elastic supply curve for labor, pinned near zero cost. For 99% of humans, whose comparative advantage is physical work, pattern recognition, or routine cognitive tasks, the market wage offered by profit-maximizing firms trends towards zero as robots substitute across sectors. Historical data already shows that robot adoption in 17 advanced economies reduced hours worked for low-skill men and depressed wages for routine jobs, while raising productivity and profits, an early preview of the broader displacement curve. The collapse of labor for survival. Today's social contract is brutally simple: work to survive. Humans supply labor, receive wages, and use those wages to buy food, shelter, and services produced by capital. In macro data, labor's share of national income in many advanced economies has drifted downward from around 65–70% to closer to 55–60% over recent decades, while capital's share has grown. Meaning and power are structurally tied to the system. Employment status predicts not only income, but social status, mental health, and self-reported life satisfaction. In Finland's basic income experiment, a modest unconditional payment of around $640 per month to 2,000 unemployed people improved health and happiness, even when it barely changed work hours, highlighting how deeply psychological well-being is linked to perceived agency in the labor market. When Optimus-class robots can provide food, housing construction, logistics, manufacturing, and even basic care services at near zero marginal cost, the old equation, labor for wages, wages for survival, breaks down. A relatively small number of firms owning robotic capital could, in theory, meet the basic physical needs of entire populations with a fraction of today's human workforce, leaving hundreds of millions of people economically redundant. In that scenario, the market wage for most people falls toward zero, not because they lack skills in an absolute sense, but because machines can perform their tasks more cheaply and at scale. The economic agency that people derived from selling their time disappears. No employer needs them, no market bids for their effort, and their traditional ROT to income vanishes. The risk of God, like capital owners, if nothing changes in the rules of distribution, the ownership of the first truly scalable robot fleets becomes the single greatest concentration of economic power in human history. Those who own robotic capital would control not just factories, but the entire supply chain of survival. Automated farms, construction swarms, delivery drones, elder care robots, and AI-driven services. The dynamic is visible already in the data. The global industrial robotics market, valued between roughly $18 and $24 billion in 2024, depending on methodology, is projected to grow at compound annual rates above 13%, reaching $84 billion by 2034. This kind of scaling, combined with network effects in AI models, naturally pushes toward oligopoly, or even winner-take-all structures, where a few platforms dominate global robotic operating systems. In macro terms, if labor's share of income shrinks while capital's share soars, and if capital ownership is highly concentrated, inequality explodes. Gini coefficients, already high in many countries, would move into unprecedented territory as returns to robotic capital compound for a narrow elite, while the majority lose their only bargaining chip, scarce human labor. Without intervention, the owners of robotic capital become de facto sovereigns. Their platforms mediate access to everything from food distribution to housing construction to medical logistics, giving them structural leverage over governments and populations. Political power follows economic power, and the risk is a new class of near-god-like rulers presiding over a population that is economically useless, dependent, and expendable in purely market terms. Universal high income as a patch. Universal basic income has been debated for decades, but in a world of robotic capital, it becomes less a philosophical experiment and more a necessary systems patch. The core idea is simple. Every person receives a regular, unconditional cash payment, large enough to cover basic survival, funded by taxes or dividends on capital, particularly robotic and AI-driven capital. Pilot programs and emergency transfers give a preview of the impact of guaranteed income on human outcomes. In Namibia's basic income trial, household poverty fell from 76% to 37% in 1 year, and child malnutrition dropped from 42% to 17% in 6 months. In Brazil, an emergency transfer of around $110 per month to roughly a quarter of the population drove poverty to its lowest level in 40 years in half a year, showing the blunt power of cash when basic needs are the binding constraint. Across at least 38 basic income style experiments in OECD countries and beyond, common findings include reduced stress, improved health, higher school attendance, and more entrepreneurial or educational activity, even when employment levels do not dramatically change. These experiments are small compared to what would be needed in a full robotic economy, but they validate a crucial point. People do not simply stop acting when their survival is guaranteed. Instead, they redirect effort toward education, care, and creative pursuits. In a future where the physical cost of providing food, housing shells, energy, and basic health care is driven down by robots, the main economic constraint on universal high income becomes political and distributional, not technological. Universal high income, significantly above bare-bones subsistence, could be funded by taxes on robotic output, sovereign robotic wealth funds, or mandatory equity stakes for citizens in robot platforms, effectively socializing a portion of the robotic capital returns. From correlative work to symbolic work, for most of history, work has been a correlative pursuit. People engage in tasks correlated with survival, farming, manufacturing, services, and receive money, which correlates with access to resources. This relationship compressed multiple dimensions of human life, purpose, identity, status, into a single symbol: the job, with its title, salary, and prestige. Empirical evidence shows how deep this compression runs. Unemployment, even when income is partially replaced, correlates with higher rates of depression, anxiety, and reduced life satisfaction compared to employment. That is because work has been the dominant symbolic compression, the main way societies signal who matters, who belongs, and where each person stands in the social hierarchy. When Optimus and its successors take over correlative work, first in factories and logistics, then in services, and eventually in many white-collar tasks, the human role shifts from producing material outputs to producing meaning. Art, philosophy, scientific exploration, virtual world design, and the creation of complex social games become not side activities, but the core arenas where human agency expresses itself. In this world, salaries matter less as a rationing mechanism for physical goodness and more as a way to allocate access to symbolic experiences, unique events, scarce in-person communities, or high-status cultural artifacts. The work of the future is the manufacture of new symbolic compressions, new narratives, identities, and social structures that give people a reason to act in a universe where survival is no longer at stake. Economics of meaning markets. As robotic capital saturates physical production, the fastest growing sectors of the economy are likely to be what can be called meaning markets, industries that sell experiences, status, identity, and narrative. Already, intangible assets, brands, software, IP, make up a majority of firm value in many stock markets, a data point suggesting that societies are shifting from material scarcity to symbolic scarcity. In a robotic economy, the marginal cost of another unit of food or generic apartment might be close to zero, but the marginal cost of a unique experience, time with a particular creator, participation in a specific game world, membership in a tightly knit community, remains high because human attention and genuine social connection are finite. Prices in these markets reflect not the physical cost of production, but the scarcity of authentic participation and the strength of collective belief in a symbol's value. Much like luxury brands today, universal high income sets a floor under demand in these meaning markets, ensuring that people can participate even if they never sell traditional labor into the economy. Policy then shifts from trying to create jobs in obsolete sectors to enabling access to education, tools, and platforms that let individuals create and exchange meanings, stories, and experiences. Macroeconomic stability will depend less on employment rates in manufacturing and more on the health of these symbolic economies. Measures of social cohesion, mental health, participation rates in civic and cultural life, and the diversity of viable meaning niches. Traditional metrics like GDP will need to be supplemented with indicators of subjective well-being and social capital, because output alone no longer predicts whether a society is thriving. The new social games. When survival is guaranteed, people still need structure, challenge, and recognition. Without those, societies drift into listlessness, even if basic needs are met. Basic income experiments report that while participants feel less stress, they still seek purposeful activity, education, caregiving, entrepreneurship, when given stable support. This suggests that humans are wired not just for comfort, but for narratives in which their actions matter. Future social institutions will likely take the form of complex games with explicit rules, goals, and prestige systems, layered on top of a robotic material substrate. Some of these games will look like extended research quests, global collaborations to understand consciousness, simulate galaxies, or engineer ecosystems on Earth and beyond. Others will be cultural, co-authored universes, persistent virtual worlds, and nested communities with their own rituals, symbols, and currencies. Education systems will transform into long, open-ended training grounds for navigating and contributing to these games, rather than pipelines into specific jobs. Credentials that once signaled fitness for labor markets will instead signal readiness to participate in certain meaning ecosystems, much like guild ranks or game achievements. Even politics will be gamified. Citizens may allocate portions of their universal, high income to fund specific missions, experiments, or civic projects, turning budgets into collective strategy games where public attention becomes as important as tax revenue. The legitimacy of governments will rest less on managing unemployment and more on curating fair, rich, and accessible meaning landscapes. The unavoidable decisions, the transition to a robotic capital civilization, forces a set of decisions that can no longer be postponed. First, how is ownership of robotic capital structured, purely private and concentrated, broadly distributed through citizen funds, or hybrid public-private models that guarantee everyone a stake in robot productivity. Second, what form should universal high income take? Flat cash transfers for all residents, tiered by age or region, or combined with in-kind guarantees of housing, healthcare, and connectivity. The cost of a foundational universal income equal to roughly 1% of GDP per capita, as some analyses suggest for India and other emerging economies, is fiscally manageable with modest tax or dividend mechanisms once robotic productivity gains are realized. Third, how are meaning markets governed to avoid new forms of symbolic inequality, where a small elite monopolizes the highest status experiences, while others drift in low agency digital loops? This requires regulation of attention platforms, transparency for AI-driven recommendation systems, and public investment in open cultural and scientific spaces where people can contribute without paywalls. Finally, how does humanity redefine success when GDP growth and employment rates no longer capture what truly matters? Societies must choose what to optimize for well-being, creativity, exploration, justice, and design institutions accordingly. Because in a robotic economy, the technical constraints are loosened and the moral constraints become primary. Optimus and its successors will not just reshape factories, they will rewrite the deep code of economics, dissolving the centuries-old link between labor and survival. Universal high income is the minimal patch to keep this new system stable. But beyond that lies a harder task: inventing a civilization where the main job is no longer to stay alive, but to decide what to do with a life that is, for the first time, structurally unchained from work.